Option 2, mind-brain identity theory. You could go the other direction here. Not only are the mind and the brain not fundamentally different kinds of things, they're actually the very same thing. The mind just is the brain. That's the slogan form. More precisely, what we're going to say is each type of mental state, like a belief or a desire, or maybe even, well, let's leave it at that. A belief or a desire is going to be identical to some specific type of brain state. And we don't know which. We got to do some science to figure that out, but we're doing philosophy right now. Beliefs are going to be identical to this kind of brain state over here that looks like this with these neurons and blah, blah, blah. And desires are going to be identical to some other kind of brain state in some maybe other kind of area of the brain or whatever. It's unclear how fine-grained we should be on our types of mental states. Maybe it's this beliefs in general are identical to this kind of brain state, or maybe you want to say beliefs for this kind of thing are identical to this kind of brain state. We won't go further into that. Here's your analogy. If you're wondering about what this kind of identity relationship looks like, we've discovered in the past few hundred years that water is identical to H2O. That's just what water is. We didn't know that before. We knew what water, I mean, we kind of had a concept of water. We drank it and bathed with it, stuff like that. But we didn't know what it was fundamentally. And now we know it's H2O. What's the relationship between water and H2O? They're not fundamentally different kinds of things. They're identical. Water just is H2O. Whenever you have H2O, you got water. Whenever you got water, you got H2O. And similarly, the mind-brain identity theorist says mental stuff just is brain stuff, in the same way that water is identical to H2O. That's the theory. It's pretty easy, right? Let's just talk about one problem for mind-brain identity theory. It's this. If you closely tie the nature of the mental to the nature of the human brain, you're going to have an overly narrow theory. I'll let y'all pause on this slide if you want to, and I'm going to stop sharing just for the sake of variety. But if each kind of mental state is really closely tied, is actually identical to a kind of brain state, then what you're doing is you're ruling out the possibility that other kinds of physical states could render those mental states. That's a far too complicated way of saying it. You're ruling out the possibility that other kinds of things could have mental states like ours. Other kinds of things that don't have brains like ours. And what a lot of people think is, look, we don't know whether, for example, there are extraterrestrial aliens, but if there were, and they were non-carbon based, they didn't have brains like ours, do we think that it would be impossible for them to have mental states like ours? Or do we think, no, they could still have beliefs? I'm thinking of, District 9. Is that the name of the movie? No. District 9, yeah, dude, that's an awesome movie. Anyway, in that movie, you've got aliens that have kind of settled on Earth. I think they're supposed to be non-carbon based. So here's some pictures from District 9. Here's another picture of an alien. Yeah, so they're kind of weird, like they seem to be partly built from almost like machine parts. But we want to at least preserve the possibility of those sorts of aliens having mental states. Again, we don't know whether they're aliens. We're using aliens or the possibility of aliens as like a focal point, an example. But what the general question is it possible for beings not like us in our brains, in the way their brains are constituted, or whether they even have brains? Is it possible for those sorts of creatures to have beliefs and desires and pains and things like that? And the answer seems to be yes. And a lot of us, even to draw another connection, would say our antecedent commitments, and specifically our religious commitments, commit us to that possibility. If you think that there is a God and that he is non-physical, then yes. And if you think he has beliefs or knowledge, if he knows everything, like the God of traditional theism is taken to be, then he has mental states. But he doesn't have a brain. At least God the Father, at least if you're going with Christian theology, God the Father, non-physical, Of course, God the Son, Jesus, would have a brain because he was incarnated. But if talking about the God the Father, the God of theism, traditional theism, or nonpartisan theism, has mental states, not only does he not have a human brain, he doesn't have a brain, and he doesn't have a body even. He's just totally non-physical entirely. And so if you think that's possible, then mind-brain identity theory is going to be a non-starter, because it says that you definitely can't have mental states if you don't have brain states. And if you don't have a brain like the human brain. So essentially, long story short, what we're doing here is, what the mind-brain identity theorist is doing is far too narrowly defining what it takes to have a mental state. It's just, you don't need to have a human brain to have a mental state, most people think. Okay, lastly, I'm not going to spend as much time on this because we actually talked about this the week before, or our last section on this, when we talked about Andy Clark and the Natural Born Cyborgs excerpt. A lot of people think that they can get away from dualism and the idea that the mental is just a fundamentally different kind of thing from the physical, and not commit to the problems of mind-brain identity theory if they endorse a thing called functionalism. We talked about this last week, but it's essentially the idea that you define what a particular kind of mental state is by talking about the role that it plays in the sort of causal order, right? Or in the system that it is a part of. Okay, so we talked about thermostats being functionally defined as an analogy. What makes something a thermostat is its function within a system. What causes it to turn on the sort of environmental conditions, and then what it causes to happen when it does turn on, right? To be a thermostat doesn't have to have any other properties than that, essentially. It doesn't have to be digital or analog. It doesn't have to be circular or rectangular or whatever. It doesn't even have to be manipulable by humans. Because the definition of a thermostat is a functional definition. Similarly, we could say, well, look, what makes something a belief is not what it feels like or whatever. What makes something a belief is it's the kind of thing that when your environment is like this, it produces this belief. And when the belief exists, it kind of generally causes you to act like this. So if you have a belief that there's Dr. Pepper in the fridge, then that's the sort of thing that, in combination with a desire for Dr. Pepper, will kind of cause you generally to go get the thing. And then you define desires the same way, and pains the same way. Pains are the kind of thing that are generally caused by bodily harm and generally cause you to say ouch, to wince, to try to fix the thing that went wrong, the bodily harm that is, etc. Now, the beauty of this is it doesn't tell you anything about, this view is it doesn't tell you anything about what beliefs have to be constituted by in terms of their like underlying physical state. And so humans could have beliefs because our brain states function this way, that they're caused by certain things and they tend to cause things. But if an alien came along, if District 9 were to happen, these aliens came along and we said, wait, oh man, this alien, we're looking at his brain or whatever, and he's got this state that tends to be caused by bodily harm and tends to cause him to react to that bodily harm by trying to alleviate it. And you know, the system is more complicated than that, and the causal network is more complicated than that. But with that simple analogy, we could say, wait a second, it looks like with functionalism, we can allow that alien is feeling a pain, just like we're feeling a pain, even though we have fundamentally different kinds of brains, and the alien may not have a brain at all. And similarly, non-physical beings could have states that function the exact same way. Okay, so that's the appeal of functionalism, and we won't touch on the problems here.